All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. So Sarah is the author of the book, To the Shadows, in which she shares her journey of trauma recovery. Sarah was the first victim of ex-USC gynecologist, Dr. George Tyndall, to speak about what occurred. Sarah was a master's student at USC in 2004 during this abuse. In 2010, she finally mustered the strength and courage to confront what happened, and she sent a formal complaint to USC. It was completely dismissed. It wasn't until 2018 when she saw ads about other women who'd been molested that she contacted a law firm. She wound up being one of the 20 women of the approximately 700 victims that was disposed for the ongoing lawsuit. This book is an exploration of surviving trauma and the difficult process of healing. Sarah, who's hearing impaired, tried to bury what happened, and after it was consuming her life, she went through the painful process of healing. The book also shines a spotlight on how doctors are being protected by a broken system. Sarah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So before we get going, share with our listeners where you are from originally and where you are currently.
Well, the answer is the same for both. I grew up in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and I moved around a lot. I lived in Toronto, Los Angeles, but I finally ended up back in Saskatoon. So that's where I am right now.
Okay. All right. So as I do with every interview, how the heck did we get here? How the heck did you get here? What happened?
I mean, no one should be in this position. I mean, no one should have had to go through this. And it's tragic, really, that George Tyndall got away with it for so long, that he affected so many lives. I mean, I was just going about my life as a student when I was down in USC, and I had huge dreams for myself. I was studying screenwriting, and I mean, it sounds very pie in the sky, but I had bought a vintage ball gown because I thought I was going to make it. I thought, I would be in the field and I would be going to awards events, and I really believed in myself. And then that day came where I walked into my doctor's appointment and I came out a totally different person. My life has just been...
Excuse me for interrupting. So you said your doctor's appointment. So he was at the school, he was a USC affiliate. Was this routine physical type thing?
It was a gynecology exam.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if he was actually a gynecologist or if he was just a regular doctor doing those types of exams. But that's the type of exam it was supposed to be. And it was, for me, I had a very specific reason for going in. I was having some issues that I needed looked after. He didn't look into those issues. He had his own idea about what was going to happen in that appointment, and it wasn't medical based.
Mm-hmm. So what transpires? I'm not asking for specifically what he did, but what unfolded? What were the events such that they unfolded?
Yeah. So, I mean, I talk very detailed about what he did in my book. I don't hold back on telling that story. But, I mean, he basically tried to stimulate me.
Well, I wasn't necessarily asking about what he did, but when you left that office, what occurred?
Yeah. So I didn't want to leave the office. I was very ashamed after what happened. I felt very diminished. That's the word that comes to mind. I felt very diminished as a person, and I didn't want anyone to see me. I didn't want to walk out into the hall. So, but because of my early childhood abuse experience, I already had experience of shoving that down.
Mm.
So that was my go-to way of coping. So I just shoved that right down. I didn't really do anything with it. I mentioned it to a friend briefly, and then I didn't mention it again to anyone until 6 years later when I reported
Wow.
it to the school.
Wow. Now, if I may, you mentioned an earlier abuse experience. Was that something that you had, quote unquote, worked through or tried to heal or addressed in any way?
No,
And,
so there's an
and let me
interesting,
just, before you answer, I'm in no way, I just want to mention that since we are talking about trauma here, yeah.
Yeah, there's an interesting story about my early abuse, actually. So when I was a student at USC, I was studying screenwriting, and my thesis screenplay was a story about a child who had been abused and was breaking that cycle of abuse. At that time, I had absolutely no recollection of my early abuse.
Mm.
But that just goes to show that our subconscious is constantly trying to rise up and find its way out, even when we're not consciously aware of what's going on.
Right.
And so when I did remember my early abuse, I was around 32, which was almost 10 years after I had written that screenplay.
Wow.
And I was just floored that looking back, I had sort of written the story already, without that conscious awareness. So when I experienced what I experienced with George Tyndall, I don't want to call him a doctor because I don't feel he was an ethical doctor in any way. So we'll just call him George Tyndall. I didn't know that I had already gone through that in my life. I didn't consciously know. So when I remembered my early abuse at 32, suddenly, I don't know, it just put a lot into perspective about why I couldn't speak up for myself after what happened in that doctor's room, and why I had felt so disempowered, and just a lot of how I handled that made a lot more sense.
You said it wasn't years until you told someone about what happened. What did you say? What was the context in which you shared that?
Sorry, repeat the question.
Sure. You said it was years until you took you years to tell someone. Yeah. When did you tell someone? Why did you tell someone?
Yeah, so initially, and this is interesting to me still, I reached out to USC about what had happened about 6 years after it happened.
6 years, wow, okay.
Yeah, and at the time, it wasn't for me. I just couldn't shake the feeling that he was still doing this to other people. And I thought, school needs to know what's happening.
Okay, so you were out of the school by this time?
Yeah.
Okay.
I had been out of the school for about 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, it just it stuck with me. It didn't go away, and my feeling was, if I don't tell anyone, I'm part of the problem if this is still happening. So I have to tell someone.
Sure. So what did you do? You wrote a letter? You make a phone call?
No, I used the form. Most websites have a form online. I used that to email the student health center. The student health director called me back, and basically he just dismissed me. It was a little bit condescending, and I felt like he'd had the conversation before, and he just sort of thanked me for my time and said goodbye. And the United States Department of Education actually did an investigative report on this issue, everything that transpired at USC, and they found emails regarding my complaint where not just one person, but more than one person agreed to just ignore it. In quotes, it said, "It probably won't go anywhere." So,
wow. Yeah. I mean, I can't say I'm surprised, but still, it's just, what do you say to that? I mean, so How were you dealing with this at this time? What,
I wasn't.
you
I
weren't.
wasn't dealing with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a different question. How was this affecting you?
Yes, it was affecting me hugely. I had very, very dysfunctional behaviors in relationships. I had, knee-jerk reactions. I took everything personally. I mean, there's just a myriad of, I want to call them personality defects that I had because I hadn't dealt with any of this trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I have since learned out that trauma actually changes our brain, which is pretty profound. So, I'm working with a psychiatrist now and reversing that, and it's working.
Awesome.
And I feel it working, and it's
awesome.
It's lovely.
So, at what point did you say to yourself, "I need to get some help"?
Yeah, so I actually went to Ireland for a trip. I travel alone a lot, and I went there when I was about 34, 35, around there. And that was about 2 years after I had remembered what happened to me as a child. But I had pushed that away also because I didn't want it to be true. I mean, nobody wants that to be true, right? So you just sort of tuck it away. In Ireland, I proceeded to have a really difficult morning, and it led to a massive, nervous breakdown on a packed train. And I just had never experienced something like that before. But as I sat there recovering, it took about 2 hours, which was good. And that's how long the train ride was. And I needed that time to just sit there and recover. But I knew that something was breaking apart, that I couldn't hold what I was holding in anymore, and that I would need to go home and deal with this. So it was interesting. I got off the train, I went to my hotel, and then my manager called and said that I wouldn't have a job to come back home to. So everything fell apart that day. Okay. But it was a huge gift because I came home to space. I came home to having space to heal and just focus on me, and it was lovely.
So did you begin seeing someone, a therapist or psychiatrist or whomever? How did the healing process evolve for you, work for you?
I didn't start seeing my psychiatrist until well into the lawsuit, actually, but I started seeing a therapist who does integrative body psychotherapy. And so she's a very trauma-informed therapist. And I specifically called around in the city asking for a counselor who was experienced with sexual abuse. And those phone calls led me to her. And I'm just so grateful I was sent to her because I've worked with therapists in the past on other issues. One of them actually sent me out the door because she didn't think she could deal or work with me on my issues, right? So I landed in the right place at the right time. And then I moved into my dog. Okay. So I moved into seeing a psychiatrist during the lawsuit, and I learned a lot from her, and she put me on some medication which stabilized my moods. I was really resistant to taking medicine in the beginning, let me tell you. I did not want to do that, but I tried going off of it a few times, and my moods come back. I just get moody, and I've been like that for most of my life as a result of the trauma, right? It's PTSD is what I've learned, but the medication stabilizes me, and so it's been a huge gift.
So you saw the therapist first before you saw the psychiatrist. Was there anything that you can point to that the therapist did that really helped you?
Yes, she held space for me in such a beautiful way. She didn't directly validate or invalidate my experience. She just allowed space for my experience to come forward, which I think was so important because I went into therapy still questioning the validity of my memories. Like I said, what happened to me when I was young was sort of unbelievable, and I didn't want to believe it anyways. And then when she guided me through a lot of that body work, I realized, okay, you can maybe fake a memory through talking, but your body does not fake what's happening. I wouldn't have these emotional holds all over my body if nothing had happened. And so that body focused therapy, I think, was so important for me.
So, talk a little bit about this, the lawsuit, and then I want to get into the book. So, when did you become aware of the lawsuit, and how were you involved?
So I remember it specifically, and it annoyed me when I discovered it because it was 2018, and I was just sitting there at home. It was a lovely winter day. I was cozy on my couch, and I was like, I finally feel like I'm ready to like begin the next chapter of my life, that maybe I don't need to go to therapy anymore. And I'm scrolling through Facebook, and then I see that ad, and those moments where time just freezes. It was one of those moments when I saw George Tyndall's face on that ad. Time froze, and it was probably like 5 seconds. I had to really look at that photo, and then it all came back to me, and I was like, oh, that's the doctor that did that to me in my appointment. And it was interesting because I think it was a matter of minutes before I started Googling law firm. And it took me 2 years to go to therapy for my childhood assault because I wasn't an empowered person at that point. So coming out of therapy, I had gained back some of my power. And within minutes, I was, taking action to stand up for myself. So I've become a huge advocate for healing because we can't protect ourselves if we're disempowered, and trauma steals our power.
Right. So, and you took part in that lawsuit. You were deposed. One of the people who were deposed.
Yeah, because of the email, the complaint I filed and the emails they found, that there was evidence for my claim, I guess, and that's why I was one of the women who were deposed in that suit. Litigation is hugely stressful, and I just have to say I have such respect for my lawyers. I hate that lawyers get a bad reputation for being cold and calculating, because I have to tell you, my lawyers were some of the most kind-hearted people I have ever met.
Wow.
They expertly, they did their job, and they held space for me when I was, to be quite frank, very vulnerable.
Wow, that's awesome to hear. I appreciate you sharing that. So how did the book come about? And I want to remind everyone that we're speaking with Sarah Craig. She's the author of the book, To the Shadows.
So I started writing the book actually when I started therapy around 2015. And because I'm a writer, I've always been a writer. I mean, my university degrees are in writing. I just felt like I had to document my healing journey. I didn't know why exactly. And then I pulled out a lot of the stuff I had written over the years. It was like a huge stack of papers, just journal entries and little stories. And I had about half of my book already there, compiled. And which was interesting to me, that I had sort of already been working towards that without really knowing it. And then as I went through therapy, I realized why I was writing my story. And it's because when you're going through therapy and healing from trauma, it feels so alone. You feel so alone. You feel like, it's just you. And I mean, that's sort of how it is anyways. But I found there were a lot of instances where I didn't understand what was happening to me. Like when I was having panic attacks or a bad anxiety, which is a part of the healing process. I didn't understand that was part of the healing process at the time. So in those moments, I was like, oh, I need to go to the hospital, I'm having a heart attack. I overreacted in a situation that was actually quite normal to the healing process. And so I wrote this book to sort of walk people through a lot of the steps that they're going to encounter on the healing journey.
Let me ask you something. You had this, well, initially as a young child, an abuse experience, and then as a more mature woman, another experience. What do you want people to know about trauma and about the healing process? What do you feel is important for them to know? Because to me, let me just say that it feels to me, Sarah, like you're so giving of yourself and your experience. I mean, you're putting it all in this book. And I'm not asking you to condense the whole book, but what is it what message do you want people to hear?
That there's nothing to be ashamed of. I mean, that's the key. I mean, trauma, sexual assault specifically, is still so stigmatized. And until we start having this conversation at large, things are not going to change. I mean, look at how many women were abused at USC just by one man alone, and how long it took for that to come out and for us to receive justice. I mean, we're talking decades.
Mm-hmm.
I also want people to know that when they see this happening and they don't speak out, they are part of the problem. If you turn a blind eye to these issues, you are part of the problem. And that's why I'm such an advocate for us to talk about these issues.
Mm-hmm. For example, the people to whom you sent the email and who read the email about your experience, right? They didn't do anything. They dismissed it. They ignored it.
That's right. And
right.
They were part of the problem.
Right, right.
And I wonder, I do wonder in hindsight, if they had sat back and thought about what their actions were really doing and how many women would go on to be hurt, if they would have made a different choice. I'm not sure if they would have, but I wonder if that would have made a difference, because they obviously felt a larger obligation to protect the reputation of the school in that moment over the health and wellness of the students who, were making that school a reality.
Right, right.
Which is a problem. I mean, leadership was a problem.
Right. And we see this time and time again, right? With the doctor who abused the gymnastic team. That went on for a long time. That coach at, what was it, Penn State?
There's another one at UCLA.
Yeah. So in terms of, we mentioned it in the bio, you're saying this is a broken system. And we're just seeing this again and again. What is that saying to you?
Well, I may be a bit too optimistic here, but I think things are starting to change. I mean, the tides are starting to turn. If they weren't, we wouldn't be seeing justice. We wouldn't even be seeing these stories come out to be heard.
Right.
So I do think the tides are changing. I think that the right leadership has to be in place, and the people who work in these institutions need to know that they will not be reprimanded if they protect the students.
Right, right. All right. So as we kind of wind down here, I want to ask you a couple more questions. First, who's the book for?
The book is for people who are on the recovery journey.
Okay.
And also supporters of people who are on the recovery journey, because I think it's really important that we understand what trauma entails when we haven't experienced that ourselves, but we have someone close to us who has.
Okay. And in terms of the audience here, we're a lot of therapists are listening to this, a lot of survivors are listening to this as well. But what do therapists need to hear about your experience or the healing journey in general? What do they need to know when they're working with people who've experienced this type of trauma?
That's a good question. I mean, I think for me, I found having a safe space, having a safe therapist is really the most important thing. I've been with therapists who I didn't continue on with because I could feel judgment from them. And I think being trauma informed as a therapist is so important, because just having that mindset allows you to hold space for that healing process.
You're also hosting a workshop for people who've experienced trauma as well?
Well, yes, I'm actually getting my certification for coaching.
Okay.
I want to work specifically with the trauma survivors who are working their way out of therapy and segueing into being independent. There's sort of a transition period there where we start relying so much on a therapist. So I'll be hosting a beta group in the fall for survivors who want to take that step.
Okay. And where can people access information on that?
So on my website, there's a list that they can join to sign up for that. And it will be first come, first serve.
Okay. Awesome. All right, Sarah, man, just intense. I mean, you are so inspiring. I really appreciate you coming on here and taking the time to talk about this. I mean, I don't think maybe people do realize, but to go through what you've gone through and to be sitting here and talking about this, right? I mean, what is that like for you?
I mean, it feels like I'm being called to do it. It is daunting to put yourself out there and bare your soul and talk about all those things that happen, but it's part of my passion for making the world a better place.
Awesome. Well, you're welcome back anytime. I'd love to keep in touch. And again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.